Chair recognizes Councilman Oh.
Thank you very much, Council President. I offer one bill and may be heard after the title is read.
Certainly, thank you, Councilman.
Thank you very much.
An ordinance amending Section 9627 of the Philadelphia Code entitled Commercial Establishments on Residential Block Faces by revising requirements and making related changes.
Chair recognizes Councilman Oh.
Thank you very much, Council President. First, I'd like to say that I'm introducing for consideration of our council body an amendment. There's nothing wrong with the bill itself. Unfortunately, the bill has resulted in some problems, which I think a amendment, a clarification would help. And I would like to say that I think it is appropriate because, unfortunately, the way it has turned out, however it has happened, the city's enforcement of this bill is very discriminatory and unjust. This bill is being enforced by the police because L&I is not enforcing the bill. This bill is being enforced by the police because L&I has not written any regulations or process to enforce it fairly, and probably the entire process of enforcing the bill is illegal, probably. The bill is being enforced in commercial areas where the bill does not apply, and where it does apply, it is being enforced against businesses very unevenly and unfairly. It's being enforced against some businesses and not others. In particular, 96% of the businesses that were closed and fined by the police were only Chinese takeout restaurants. That is very strange. The Chinese population in this city might be 1%, and 96% of the violations are against only Chinese takeout restaurants. People will say they're getting fined and closed by the police because they're doing something wrong, and that's the beginning of the problem. When the police go someplace and do something, people assume those people must be doing something wrong. The next thing is when people say, well, I think they're being discriminated against, but they deserve it. And we've heard that many times in our country. We've heard it with African Americans, we've heard it with LGBT, we've heard it with Irish Americans, we've heard it with Italian Americans, with Jewish Americans, Muslim Americans. We could go down the line. The good news is our country stands for values and the wonderful experiment that we can govern ourselves, and the second experiment that all of us diverse people can do that fairly and appropriately within the democratic process. One of the things that I would like to say is that the double standard that has existed throughout the history of America is problematic. And I'm going to speak up about it just a little bit because it's oftentimes not understood. I will have people say to me, well, you know, the Chinese didn't participate in the civil rights movement, and therefore this is what they get. I will have other kind of statements like that, which is very grossly unfair and unsubstantiated. But let me start with this. In 1790, you could not be a citizen unless you're a white man. Couldn't be. And in 1882, Congress passed a law that excluded the Chinese, or anyone who looked Chinese, from coming to the United States or becoming a citizen. That did not end until 1943. And we've had generations of Americans born in this country of Asian ancestry who could not vote. Could not vote anyway. And they were forced to carry papers that proved where they lived. You could be born in America, a third generation, and you had to have papers to prove that you lived in a house somewhere in the United States or you would be deported. And I tell people the reason we have all these immigration laws that we're now talking about is not because of the Mexicans or the Muslims, it was because of the Chinese. The Chinese Exclusion Act excluded Chinese from coming to this country. And if you were a citizen, if you left this country, the federal government would not let you back in. And the United States government pressured Canada to exclude Chinese, and it tried to pressure Mexico, but the Mexicans did not want to be under pressure from the U.S., and so we built up the southern border. In 1871, in Los Angeles, there was a mass lynching, which almost nobody heard of. Nobody remembers because it's not taught in the history books. 500 people went through the Chinese area of Los Angeles, going into homes, stealing property, stealing items, smashing things, and they took out 18 people, Chinese Americans, shot them and lynched them. But the law in Los Angeles, as in many parts of this United States, was that people of Chinese ancestry were not allowed to testify against white people. That's the history of our country. In 1910, Pittsburgh passed an ordinance. Fortunately, the mayor vetoed it. I think there were about 45 council members. 43 of them voted for an ordinance that Chinese restaurants had to close earlier than any other restaurant, and that women could not eat or work in a Chinese restaurant. That was 1910 in Pittsburgh. That was not unusual, because throughout the history of that time period, from after and before the Civil War, through that period of time, Chinese restaurants were competing with other restaurants, Chinese restaurants and Chinese laundries, because despite all the suppression, Chinese couldn't go to school. All the suppression, the Chinese found places where they could make money. Laundry and restaurants were one of those. And so the laws were passed throughout the United States that forbade women and others. The AFL in that time issued a statement to all the legislators that beer and noodles are the corruption of America. Beer and noodles. And so we have seen after that the Japanese who purchased farms lose all their farms because they were the enemy in World War II, and so many of their children served in the United States military and were highly decorated in World War II. In 1982, Vincent Chin, a Chinese American who served in our military, was at a bar when two men approached him in Detroit and said, because of you Japanese, we're unemployed. They started to beat him in the bar. He ran out. That's called a break in the action for the lawyers. They chased him outside, beat him up some more. He ran away. They grabbed a couple of baseball bats from their car, chased him down the street, and beat him to death in front of McDonald's. He was given probation, manslaughter, and the judge said, these are good people. The family reached out to all the civil rights organizations, and none of them responded, in part because of this problem, the model minority issue. And so that issue arises because some people, typically identified as Republicans, say, look at the Asians, they're doing very well in our country, why do other people have a problem? And the other folks, typically Democrats, say, because they are light-skinned and they've received a lot of favoritism from white America, and we call them Democrats. Well, neither is true. Both are very ignorant statements. Many Asian Americans face discrimination, poor education, health issues. They don't have insurance and things like that. Yes, some Asian Americans are doing well despite all these problems. And again, they're not the only group of people. Women have not been able to vote, African Americans, Caribbean, African immigrants, many people in our country. So it's a continuing issue of how we treat ourselves fairly and not rely on prejudice and unfounded statements. Today, ALDEF, the Asian American Legal Defense and Education Fund, will serve this city with a letter to desist enforcement of this very unfair process. I thank the mayor and the police department for the temporary suspension of the enforcement that is very selective and discriminatory. But it's not enough. We do and should, as a body, amend this law to be clear and logical so that it serves its good purpose that it was written for. And I appreciate the members of this council, yourself especially, Council President, for your leadership in always trying to ensure that our city leads the way in fairness and equity for all people. I will say that many of the people here today, they are struggling. Many of them don't have a great deal of education. They couldn't get a job anywhere else. Just like the other people we talked about, they have to find a way to earn money for themselves with the thinnest of margins. They make their money by not turning on the heat. They work 16 hours a day, 7 days a week. That's how they do it. And these fines are not only illegal, they're crippling their businesses. So with that, I would ask everyone in Philadelphia, all fair-minded people, and especially our legislative body and our mayor, to ensure that our process is fair, that we send a message to the people that it is not okay to discriminate, and that we enforce the laws fairly and appropriately. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilman.